Bismillah, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good evening. I want to continue with our journey with the seerah, the biography of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Now, in the last video, last week, we talked about the Meccan phase of the life of the Prophet, and we're looking at, in particular, the topic of war, jihad, seer. We're going to be covering briefly some of these concepts and how the centrality of how these things must be understood is through the life of the Prophet. Because for Muslims, the Prophet, peace be upon him, is the blueprint. His life, his legacy for Muslims is where we get our guidance from. Now, last week I talked about the Meccan phase, which was filled with hostility towards Muslims, where Muslims maintained a sense of patience, a sense of perseverance, despite the hostility that they had to endure. Now, in the Medinan period, which is really the second phase, and probably an important phase of the messengership of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the Prophet's invitation to Yathrib, it later on became known as Medina, literally city, by a number of delegations. So he was invited by a number of delegations. Some of them also included women, and they pledged to the Prophet their allegiance and to support him as well. And this, many ways, many authors would say, had a religious aspect to it, but also a political aspect to as well. So the invitation that they had extended to the Prophet, peace be upon him. And we've talked a little bit about the migration, the hijrah of the Prophet from Mecca to Medina in previous videos. But many authors would say that this pledge, this invitation of the Prophet to come to Yathrib, to Medina, what would be called Medina later on, had both a political and had a religious aspect as well. And many Western academics also say this as well. From a religious perspective, it meant accepting a new religion, which was Islam here. Of course, Muslims say it's not just a new religion, it's a continuation of monotheism that was sent to mankind by every prophet by God. And so politically, it also meant that they accepted the Prophet, peace be upon him, as the arbiter between the many opposing factions that existed in the troubled city of Yathrib, the oasis town, if you like, of Medina. So there was a lot of troubles, there was a lot of issues between the various tribes, and they saw the Prophet politically as someone who could bring peace and stability. And of course, he fulfilled that role very, very valiantly as well. In fact, they justified their invitation to Prophet, and they actually said to him that they hoped that God would unite them, right? The opposing factions at Medina through the Prophet as well. So that's something to bear in mind. So there was a religious aspect, there was also a political aspect as well. The point to be noted here is that the Muslims had, of course, fled from Mecca to another troubled place, Medina, and it was inhabited by several Jewish clans. There were people who were polytheists, idolaters, and there were few people who, of course, had become Muslims as well. And there was no recognized form of judicial or political authority in this hostile city, in this city of Medina. And this was the case throughout Medina or throughout Arabia at the time as well. And in fact, each clan or tribe only recognized the authority of its leader, right? That's it. They recognize their leader, and that's it as well. And so this is why when the delegation came to the Prophet, peace be upon him, to invite him to Medina, to Yathrib, they were hoping that he would bring stability and peace to the oasis town as well. Now, it's important for researchers who study the tradition of war, the tradition of jihad, that when they study this in Islam, that they study in terms of how the Prophet, peace be upon him, organized the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims in this newly established state system. Very, very important. Any conversation must begin from the blueprint of how the Prophet established this community, this community in the city of Medina. Now, we all know that the Prophet, when he moved to Medina, he began his stay by building a mosque. That was the first thing that he did. And in fact, if you reflect and if you study the two sermons, Friday's sermons by the Prophet, he addresses the topic of monotheism, believing in one God, and piety. And he actually calls upon people to love one another, to have love and respect for one another. And he talks about the nature of relationships between people of different religions and faiths and not in the city of Medina. There's a document that's often ascribed to this period called the Sahifa al-Medina, which is translated as the Constitution of Medina. And this is really important in terms of getting an insight into questions around this newly established state system, right? And its conception of nationhood, including the concept of war and peace in Islam as well. There's a general agreement among scholars that this document of Medina is authentic. And some Western scholars do disagree whether it was written before the Battle of Badr, which we haven't covered yet, or after the Battle of Badr as well. So there's some discussion around its when it was actually constituted, but they say that it was written at this period or during this period of the life of the Prophet as well. And so the biographers, anyway, when they look at the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, they do agree that the first achievement that the Prophet was able to achieve was build a mosque. He formed a brotherhood between the Muhajirun. These are the people who'd left Mecca and made their way to Medina. So they were called the Muhajirun, the immigrants, and the Ansar, the helpers, the people in Medina who, of course, welcomed the Prophet, peace be upon him as well. And he also concluded a peace treaty with the Jews of the community, and there was a rapprochement. There was coming together, if you like, of the Jewish community and the new Muslim community established in the city of Medina, or the oasis town of Yathrib as well. So forming brotherhood between Muslims and concluding peace with the Jews are some of the things that this document actually talks about. The Prophet was very much engaged in bringing people together as well. And in fact, the document itself addresses the relationship between the immigrants and the helpers, the Muhajirun and Ansar, to the Muslim community in the first half. And in the second half of this document, there's discussion around Jews and the Muslims, right? And so some scholars have actually said there were two separate documents, because the first half deals with relationship between the Muhajirun and Ansar, the immigrants and the helpers, and the second half of the document deals with the relationship between the Muslims and the Jews. So some scholars do say that it was two separate documents that were written. So anyway, that's something that's just mentioned as an academic point as well. Many scholars do agree that it was written before the Battle of Badr, so before the first real war took place, which we'll come on to later on as well. And so it concludes that the Prophet initiated or concluded a peace treaty with all the Jewish clans upon his arrival in Medina. And the Jewish clan of Banu Qaynuqa, who we will talk about later on, was in fact the first community, first clan which broke this peace agreement, right? Actually, it happened in the 20th month after the Prophet's arrival. So within a year or so, within 2 years, they broke this peace treaty that they had with the Muslims, the tribe of Banu Qaynuqa, and we'll come to them later on, inshallah. And so the first sentence of this particular document, it actually has a reference to the past. So this is before Islam, in terms of the term jihad. So it actually has a reference to the word jihad. And it actually reads, and I'll read this in English, this is a writing from Muhammad, the prophet between the believers and the Muslims from Quraysh and Yathrib. And those who followed them, joined them, and jahad, the word is jahad, with them, that they are one ummah, they are one community or nation from among people. So the word, not jihad is used, but a similar word, which is jahad, as well. And of course, there was no fighting. So what could this word have meant? There was no fighting between Muslims or anybody until this point. So what could this word have meant? Various authors, various people have commented as to what this word jahad means. One of them is that he labored or they labored, right? Some say it was striving, and different authors have said different things about it. But remember, there's no fighting that took place between the Muslims or anybody at this point. So when this document was written, there was no fighting. So what does this mean when it's referring to this idea that they joined them and they jahad? The word is used in Arabic is jahad with them as well. And so this document, because it talks about a nation formed of Jews and Muslims coming together, right? The whole context then must mean that they strove or they made an effort to live peacefully together in this new ummah system, in this new community. Very, very important. Now, the more important point here is that the constitution of Medina, it stipulates a state system that makes the Prophet the head of the state, and second, affirms the Medina as the Haram. The Haram basically means it's a sanctuary for everybody who signs and agrees to this document, right? And so there's total prohibition of violence and bloodshed. And in fact, one Western author, Yuri Rubin, says that Medina was made sacred with strict rules against bloodshed, and its inhabitants were expected to protect and be devoted to it, just as Quraysh were devoted to their own haram in the city of Mecca. So it became almost like a mirror image of Mecca, where no violence was allowed to be used at all. Okay, and it also goes further, the statement or the document, to say that if there are any disagreements, if there are any disputes, it will be referred to God, to Allah and His Prophet, peace be upon him as well. And so the first half of this document, lists a number of clans from Medina and makes them all part of one community, right? Along with Muslims that had migrated from the Quraysh as well. The second half talks about, like I said, about the Jewish clans, and also makes them part of the community, not a religious community, because obviously there are religious differences, but part of a community, right, with the Muslims. Now, the inclusion of the Jews in this new ummah state, an affirmation that Jews have the right to practice their religion and the Muslims have their own religion, indicates that this ummah, right, this ummatic state, which emerged inside this tribal political system, is no longer just purely a religious community. It's much more broader than that as well. And it also, this statement, the constitution, goes further and stipulates a collective defensive agreement, right, that between the Jews and the Muslims, that if anybody was to attack any one of them, they would both come together to defend each other, right? So there was this agreement very early on as well. And so Medina becomes the Haram. It becomes a place that is sacred as well. And mutual cooperation is to take place between the Muslims and the Jews, right? And in fact, they actually say that وَإِنَّ بَيْنَهُمْ النُّصْحَ وَالنَّصِيحَةَ, that mutual advice and consultation should exist between Muslims and Jews as well. So it affirms the need for loyalty, for helping those who've been wronged, and confirms, as we've talked about before, that the state of relations between the Muslims and the Quraysh was one of war. When the Quraysh waged, when they basically disowned the Muslims who'd left, that become a state of war between them, and because they'd made them leave their homes. So the Quraysh were never part of this agreement, but the Jewish community, all the people that lived in Medina, they were all part of this new emerging community that agreed to live peacefully together and to follow an understanding of collective goodwill and working closely together. So that's the early constitution, which I just wanted to briefly touch upon in the city, or in the oasis town of Medina. Very, very important history that one must be familiar with. I've just briefly touched upon it, but one must know this if we're going to have any conversation about how Islam came about and Islam's understanding and conceptualization of jihad and war and everything else. Now, there's one more thing I want to talk about before I end, and I'll extend the discussion on this next week, if God wills, which is this idea of ghazawat, the Prophet's ghazawat. Now, you have to remember that the harsh natural conditions of Arabia led to what's called, it was a pre-Islamic practice, really, of what's called ghazw. which is raiding basically. And this wasn't unique to Arab communities. This was unique. This was also part of other communities as well. And so people would, the idea was you take people's camels, other animals for their milk and meat as well. Now it's difficult for us to understand this today because in the modern world we don't really do this, right? And especially when you translate this word ghazw into English, because it sounds like you're raiding somebody, like you're basically going to a vulnerable group of people and you're raiding them. However, scholars do say that it was actually very, very much a practice which was governed by an elaborate protocol as well. In fact, Montgomery Watt, a famous historian, says that this was a normal feature of desert life. It was kind of sport rather than war, and it was a sort of game as well. In fact, Fred McGraw Donner, who's written a book on jihad as well, even when Islam came about, this was already frequent. This was a frequent practice that was taking place in Arabia as well, especially amongst the northern tribes as well. In fact, further, he says that this idea of ghazwa or this idea of raiding was a fairly effective means of redistributing economic resources in a region where the balance could easily be upset by natural calamities. So people had to do this to survive. Now, there's something I want to say here, which might not be relevant to most of you, but I'm going to quickly go through it because it's often being used, especially today, to stain Islam. There's a person called Bernard Lewis. He wrote a book, and in the book title is The Political Language of Islam. And this person, for whatever reason, completely misunderstood what ghazwa was, and he confused it with another word. And he basically he confused this word with jihad. And basically the word that he used was called razia. And the word he translated was, it's a hostile incursion, raid for the purpose of conquest, plunder, capture of slaves, right? As practiced by the Muhammadan peoples in Africa. So he completely has this misunderstanding of what this word means. And it's obviously been used by a lot of people to unfairly attack Islam. Now, I'm all up for critiquing Islam and having a discussion about certain things about our faith, and one should not feel any sort of vulnerability or be scared, right? If people want to criticize our religion, that's by all means, that's fine by us, right? We're happy to do that. But what we can't do is lie or be dishonest, or, as we say, to play dirty, right? So this person didn't quite understand. There's a misleading here. There's an idea of distortion here of the entire tradition of war in Islam. Now, hopefully, if we are able to, we'll go through that in a bit more detail as well. If you really study this properly, if you do a meticulous study of the Prophet's ghazawat, these raids that the Prophet engaged in, what you realize is that this word has actually been confused with its pre-Islamic meaning, right? So Bernard Lewis has got this completely wrong. If you read the early biographers of the Prophet, peace be upon him, they use this word to refer to all the Prophet's journeys from Medina. Every type of journey was included in the word ghazwa, right? So whether he went out to make peace treaties, whether he went out to teach people about Islam, whether he went out for Umrah, right, or to pursue people who are attacking Medina, or in any of the 9 battles that he participated in, right? So the early biographers of the Prophet, peace be upon him, their main concern was to collect accounts about the life of the Prophet and not to study the tradition of war for its own sake. So a lot of people, when they study this, they just kind of come there to see, well, what can we do to understand things about war? But these early biographers, so Ibn Hisham is one of the earlier ones, a really fundamental book that one must read, right, or familiar with. It's in 2 volumes here, right? That they were interested in collecting everything they can about the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him. In fact, Ibn Ishaq in here, he says even ghazwa included the Umrah. So when the Prophet went for the small pilgrimage or the minor pilgrimage, that wasn't war, that wasn't raiding, but they call that ghazwa because that was part of him leaving the city of Medina as well, right? So he counts, for example, that the Prophet went for 27 ghazawat. So he left the city 27 times for various reasons, not just to raid, as many of these authors sometimes have misunderstood as well. And so, um, Ibn Ishaq, who I've just referenced now, was not mistaken, because one of the words of at the time of writing Ghazwa was this idea of going for Umrah, right? Going for a pilgrimage. That's what it was as well. So the word Ghazwa can mean a journey and doesn't necessarily mean a raid, like Bernard Lewis has misunderstood, right? And this is what happens when people don't know Arabic or don't know history very well, or misconstrue history or whatever. This is what happens as well. So to conclude, in this context, the meaning of the word Ghazwa is one of the meanings the biographers had in mind when they tried to describe every single instance of the Prophet's travels or encounters with non-Muslims, right? But if you look at modern lexicons, right, they don't mention this. But if you read Ibn Hisham's As-Sirah Nabawiyya, right, you'll find that he mentions not just raids, he mentions the Prophet's Umrah, Prophet going out to give da'wah, to call people to Islam, to teach about Islam. These are also part of the Ghazawat as well. And so in the next video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to split up two types of Ghazawat. One was about going out and teaching people about Islam and making peace treaties. And the second one was the attacks on Muslims and a number of other incidents as well. I'll talk about that in the next video. I hope that you found this useful, and God willing, inshallah, we'll go into a lot more detail every Thursday evening when we look at the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And I can only pray that I can do justice to this, be honest intellectually, and I'm always happy to hear what people have to say and feedback as well. Until next week, stay safe and have a lovely weekend, and I'll see you all next week. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.